You write lyrics
some
like, if
nonsense
you write
like
lyrics
getting
like,
charged
maybe I don't really want to know how your
in
garden
England.
grows, because I just want to fly. Lately, did you ever feel the pain in the morning rain as it soaked you to the bone? If that can't get appeal to people, right, and sell, right, but then a song that comes along which goes, girls who like boys who dig girls who like boys who dig girls who like boys who love girls who like boys who dig girls who like boys who love girls who like boys, always need to love someone, girls who like boys who dig girls who like, no, 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 no. If that appeals to the mentality of a human being, then that's sad. Girls who dig boys who love girls who dig boys who dig girls who dig boys.
Before the conflict had a name, before it hardened into headlines and chart positions, Britain was already a crowded room. The early 1990s carried the weight of a decade that had promised permanence and delivered fracture. Cities had learned to survive without certainty. Industry had thinned, community had loosened, and cultural confidence had become something remembered rather than assumed. Music filled that absence not as entertainment, but as orientation. It told people where they were standing when the ground felt unreliable. London and Manchester did not oppose each other yet, but they were already different gravitational centers. One operated as a mirror, reflecting Britain back to itself through irony, detail, and self-awareness. The other functioned as a furnace, turning pressure into heat, reduction into force. These differences were not ideological at first. They were environmental. They came from streets walked daily, from rooms rehearsed in, from accents absorbed without reflection. The rivalry would later be framed as class, geography, authenticity, and posture. At this stage, it was simply distance. Blur emerged from a capital that never stops watching itself. Their music carried the sound of observation, of cataloging life as it moved past shop windows, bus stops, and park benches. Songs behaved like lenses, narrowing focus, isolating gesture, turning the ordinary into something legible. There was ambition in this, but not the kind that announces itself. It was an ambition of control, of authorship, of placing oneself at the center of interpretation rather than experience. They were less concerned with domination than with definition. Oasis formed in a city that had learned to endure without being seen. Manchester in the early 90s had already passed through its collapse and emerged louder for it. The music that rose from there did not describe life. It resisted it. Oasis songs were not portraits, they were declarations. They did not ask listeners to recognize themselves, they asked them to join. Simplicity was not limitation but strategy. It allowed emotion to travel faster than thought. It removed barriers between impulse and expression. At first, these forces did not collide. They moved on parallel paths, responding to the same cultural exhaustion with different instincts. Both rejected the imported despair of American grunge. Both turned back toward British references without nostalgia. But similarity creates proximity, and proximity creates tension. When two answers appear to the same question, comparison becomes unavoidable. The industry noticed this before the bands did. Media thrives on contrast, and Britain was ready to see itself split into sides. What mattered was not who was better, but who represented something larger. Blur began to function as an emblem of articulation. Oasis began to operate as an emblem of release. One implied intelligence, the other certainty. One framed experience, the other overwhelmed it. These were not deliberate roles. They were projections placed upon them by a culture searching for shape. The spotlight does not illuminate neutrally. It sharpens edges, exaggerates differences, and demands coherence where there was once complexity. The press began arranging them within an invisible arena. Every interview echoed louder than intended. Every offhand comment gained weight through repetition. Meaning accumulated not through intent, but through circulation. A gesture made in passing became a stance. Silence became interpreted as strategy. Once comparison enters the room, neutrality becomes impossible. Each movement is read in relation to the other, whether acknowledged or not. This was the moment before declaration, before provocation became policy. The tension lived beneath language. It could be felt in how albums were released, how tours were scheduled, how narratives were shaped. Britain itself was in a moment of redefinition, moving toward optimism while carrying unresolved fractures. Music became a proxy through which those fractures could be rehearsed safely. Rivalry offered containment. It turned diffuse anxiety into a legible conflict. What was forming was not merely a feud between bands. It was a contest over cultural authorship. Who gets to speak for a generation? Who defines what counts as real? Who occupies the center and who is pushed to the margins? These questions rarely announce themselves directly. They emerge through symbols, through repeated images, through the slow accumulation of implication. Blur and Oasis became surfaces onto which Britain projected its unresolved tensions. No one needed to declare war yet. The architecture was already in place. The stage had been built long before either band stepped fully into the light. What followed would feel sudden, explosive, and inevitable. But inevitability is always retrospective. In this opening moment, there was still ambiguity, still possibility, still the illusion that paths might diverge rather than collide. The rivalry did not begin with hatred. It began with recognition. Two forces realizing they occupied the same space. Two visions of Britishness sharing the same oxygen. The pressure had started to build. The collision had not yet occurred. But gravity does not negotiate. It only waits. Blur and Oasis did not emerge from opposing camps by design. They emerged from different forms of proximity to power. Blur formed within reach of institutions, of education, of cultural capital that did not need to be named because it was assumed. Oasis formed within reach of absence, of limitation, of a social reality that did not ask to be theorized because it was lived daily. These origins shaped not only their music, but the way each band related to recognition, authority, and visibility. Blur's early trajectory was marked by self-consciousness. Their members moved through art schools and cultural networks where reflexivity was currency. The band's identity developed through observation, irony, and framing. They learned to see Britain as material, something that could be shaped, stylized, and interpreted. This distance from experience did not mean detachment. It meant mediation. Life was not rejected. It was filtered. Songs became scenes. Characters stood in for social types. The band functioned less like a mirror and more like a curated exhibition. This mode of creation fostered a particular relationship to control. Blur's music suggested authorship. It implied that meaning could be arranged, sequenced, and refined. Even chaos appeared organized. This carried a subtle assertion of authority. To describe is to position oneself above the described. To narrate is to decide what matters. The band's Britishness was not instinctive, but constructed. Accents were performed. References were selected. Identity was assembled with intention. This was not deception. It was craftsmanship. But craftsmanship carries the risk of appearing strategic rather than sincere. Oasis arrived from a different psychological economy. Their formation was driven by immediacy rather than reflection. The Gallagher brothers did not seek to frame British life. They sought to escape its limits without leaving it behind. Their songs operated as affirmations. They were not concerned with representing social complexity. They reduced experience to momentum. Chords were simple because they needed to travel fast. Lyrics were open because they needed to be inhabited. The voice mattered more than the sentence. This simplicity was not accidental. It was adaptive. In environments where opportunity feels scarce, expression tends toward force. Oasis music moved forward, outward, and upward. It did not observe struggle. It denied its authority. This created a powerful illusion of transcendence. Listeners did not hear commentary. They heard permission. The band's confidence felt contagious because it was not argued. It was asserted. This gave Oasis an aura of inevitability, as if success was not earned but expected. These differing orientations toward the world produced incompatible relationships to desire. Blur's desire was mediated. It sought recognition through sophistication, through being understood as clever, articulate, and culturally fluent. Oasis's desire was direct. It sought recognition through scale, through presence, through occupying space so completely that questioning became irrelevant. Both wanted visibility, but they wanted different kinds of attention. One wanted to be acknowledged. The other wanted to be followed. The industry amplified these distinctions. Media narratives thrive on contrast, and both bands offered clean silhouettes. Blur could be positioned as the thinking band, the articulate chroniclers of modern Britain. Oasis could be positioned as the feeling band, the raw voice of collective aspiration. These labels simplified complex realities, but repetition hardened them into perceived truth. Once fixed, they shaped how each band was received, and eventually how each band responded to itself. Psychologically, rivalry often emerges where similarity threatens identity. Blur and Oasis were not opposites. They were competitors within the same symbolic territory. Both sought to define British music after a period of cultural displacement. Both rejected American dominance. Both drew from shared influences while emphasizing different aspects. This overlap made differentiation necessary. Without distinction, one would dissolve into the other. Rivalry offered a solution. It provided boundaries. The press played a crucial role in this process. By framing interactions as antagonistic, it externalized tension that might otherwise have remained diffuse. Comments were isolated, headlines sharpened, and ambiguity removed. What began as incidental became intentional through repetition. This is how projection operates at scale. The public does not invent conflict from nothing. It selects, magnifies, and circulates fragments until they resemble structure. Class became the most visible organizing symbol. Blur were associated with education, with cultural fluency, with a perceived ease around institutions. Oasis were associated with labor, with resistance to refinement, with authenticity defined through struggle. These associations were not fully accurate, but they were effective. They allowed audiences to locate themselves within the rivalry. To choose a band became a way of choosing a position within Britain's unresolved class narrative. This symbolic division intensified identification. Fans did not simply prefer music. They defended meaning. Attacks on one band felt like attacks on a worldview. This emotional investment fed back into the rivalry, encouraging escalation. Each band became aware that their actions resonated beyond their intentions. Words carried consequences. Silence carried implications. Once a conflict becomes symbolic, it cannot remain contained. Interpersonal dynamics added further complexity. Encounters between band members, often fueled by alcohol and proximity, became mythologized. Offhand remarks hardened into grievances. Slights became narratives. In such environments, identity collapses into performance. Each individual is no longer reacting freely. They're responding to expectation. Persona replaces spontaneity. Authenticity becomes something to be defended rather than lived. Blur responded to this pressure by leaning further into articulation. Their work became denser, more detailed, more insistent on its intelligence. Oasis responded by amplifying scale. Their music grew louder, more expansive, more confident in its own myth. Each move reinforced the contrast. Each escalation narrowed the range of possible outcomes. Retreat would have appeared as defeat. Adaptation would have looked like betrayal. The rivalry did not require conscious malice to intensify. It operated through feedback loops. Media amplified difference. Audience responded. Bands adjusted. The cycle repeated. Over time, positions hardened. What had begun as environmental divergence became ideological opposition. The conflict no longer belonged to the individuals involved. It had become a structure, sustained by attention and expectation. By the mid-1990s, the conditions were set. The field of forces had stabilized. Blur occupied the position of the interpreter. Oasis occupied the position of the conqueror. Neither role allowed for complexity. Both demanded consistency. The stage was prepared for confrontation, not because it was desired, but because it was structurally inevitable. The rivalry was no longer latent. It was waiting for an event that could crystallize it, a moment where tension could be measured, counted, and declared. The culture was ready. The industry was eager. The audience was already divided. All that remained was the spark that would turn contrast into collision. The first visible rupture did not arrive as an explosion. It arrived as a calibration. By the time the mid-1990s approached their midpoint, both bands had become aware that they were no longer moving independently. Release schedules, interviews, and public appearances were no longer neutral acts. Each decision was read through the presence of the other. What had once been parallel trajectories now bent toward a shared center of gravity. The industry began to treat proximity as provocation. Singles were no longer isolated artifacts. They became markers in a competitive landscape. The calendar itself turned into a battlefield. Dates mattered. Sequencing mattered. The assumption that there was room for more than one dominant narrative began to erode. Visibility was finite. Attention could be counted. In this environment, coexistence felt less like balance and more like threat. The moment crystallized around a decision that was logistical on the surface and symbolic beneath it. Two singles released into the same week, positioned deliberately within the same frame. What might have been routine marketing became a referendum. The question was not which song was better. It was which worldview would occupy the center. Charts transformed into scoreboards. Sales figures became moral indicators. Popularity was no longer descriptive. It was adjudicative. This shift altered the psychological stakes for both bands. Blur approached the moment as an exercise in orchestration. They understood media logic. They recognized that spectacle amplifies meaning. Their response was strategic, even theatrical. Packaging, presentation, and narrative alignment were calibrated to signal command. This was not merely about winning a chart position. It was about demonstrating mastery over the system that conferred legitimacy. Oasis experienced the same moment as Intrusion. Their momentum had been built on inevitability, on the sense that success followed naturally from belief. The idea that victory could be engineered rather than earned cut against their self-conception. Competition reframed their ascent as conditional. It suggested that confidence might need to be defended rather than assumed. This introduced friction into a persona that relied on certainty. Media coverage intensified this asymmetry. Headlines framed the event as confrontation. Language borrowed from sport and warfare. Each band was placed in a corner, each outcome presented as definitive. Nuance collapsed under repetition. The complexity of artistic practice was flattened into opposition. Once framed this way, retreat was no longer possible. Participation itself became compulsory. Psychologically, this marked a transition from rivalry as background tension to rivalry as organizing principle. Identity began to consolidate around opposition. Blur's intelligence sharpened into irony edged with disdain. Oasis's confidence hardened into defiance. Each band became more itself by becoming less flexible. This rigidity was rewarded by attention. The louder the contrast, the clearer the narrative. The clearer the narrative, the greater the amplification. The public responded by aligning. Choice replaced curiosity. To favor one band increasingly meant to reject the other. This polarization was not incidental. It provided emotional clarity in a period of cultural uncertainty. By choosing sides, listeners affirmed a version of themselves. Music became a badge rather than an experience. Taste turned into allegiance. The singles themselves bore the weight of this transformation. They were not neutral expressions. They were interpreted as statements, regardless of intention. Lyrics were scanned for implication. Melodies were read as attitude. Success or failure became evidence in an argument larger than the songs themselves. Artistic merit mattered less than symbolic placement. The result was a feedback loop that accelerated escalation. Blur's victory in the immediate contest did not resolve tension. It redefined it. Winning clarified hierarchy in one dimension while intensifying resentment in another. Oasis absorbed the loss not as information, but as injury. The sense of inevitability that had fueled their rise was challenged publicly. That challenge demanded response. This is where rivalry shifts from competition to fixation. Once loss becomes personal, every subsequent action is interpreted through grievance. Future releases are no longer simply creative steps. They are opportunities for reassertion. The conflict acquires memory. It accumulates grievances. It develops a narrative arc. At the same time, the broader cultural field was changing. Britpop had moved from insurgency to institution. What began as resistance to external dominance had become a dominant form itself. Saturation followed quickly. As the movement expanded, it required symbols to sustain coherence. The rivalry provided that symbol. It concentrated diffuse energy into a single axis of meaning. For Blur, the moment reinforced their role as architects. They had demonstrated control, but at a cost. Mastery can curdle into self-consciousness. The more deliberate the gesture, the more visible the calculation. For Oasis, the moment provoked a different response. Injury demanded expansion. Scale became the answer. Bigger songs, broader appeal, louder affirmation. The path forward would not be subtle. This phase of the rivalry did not resolve anything. It clarified positions. It fixed identities. It ensured that future interactions would carry accumulated meaning. The contest had moved beyond scheduling and sales. It had entered the realm of narrative momentum. What followed would not be about who reacted first, but about who could sustain the pressure longest. The first act of escalation was complete. The arena had been filled. The crowd had chosen sides. The rules were no longer implicit. They were being written in real time, measured in headlines, and reinforced through repetition. The rivalry had acquired direction, and direction creates inevitability. The escalation that followed did not rely on new provocations. It relied on accumulation. After the initial confrontation had fixed positions, every subsequent gesture carried residue. Albums released into this environment were no longer free-standing works. They were read as responses, whether intended or not. Silence itself became legible. Absence suggested strategy. Presence suggested confrontation. The rivalry had become the interpretive frame through which all activity passed. Oasis moved first, not by answering directly, but by expanding the field so dramatically that comparison itself felt insufficient. Their next release arrived with the force of consolidation. It did not argue. It overwhelmed. The songs reached beyond irony, beyond observation, and settled into something closer to collective ritual. Choruses were built for mass repetition. Melodies stretched toward the horizon. The music did not invite analysis. It dissolved it. Psychologically, this was a reassertion of dominance through scale. Where Blur had demonstrated control of the system, Oasis sought to render the system irrelevant by exceeding it. Success was no longer about winning a week. It was about occupying cultural space so fully that opposition felt marginal. This was not retaliation. It was conquest. The effect was immediate. Public attention shifted. The narrative tilted. Blur responded from a position of visible strain. Their next work arrived under the weight of expectation that was no longer theirs to define. Where their earlier confidence had felt light, it now appeared burdened. The music remained intricate, observational, and formally ambitious. But ambition in this context risked being read as effort. Intelligence risked being mistaken for defensiveness. The very qualities that had distinguished them now appeared to lock them in place. This dynamic illustrates a familiar pattern in symbolic rivalry. The side associated with articulation often struggles once the contest moves from definition to domination. Precision excels in early stages, but mass identification rewards force. Oasis's appeal operated less through persuasion than through saturation. Their songs did not need to be understood to be felt. They filled rooms, fields, and airwaves with anthemic certainty. In doing so, they reframed success itself. Media coverage followed this shift seamlessly. Narratives that had once celebrated wit and self-awareness pivoted toward scale and inevitability. The press does not hold loyalty. It follows momentum. As Oasis grew larger, the story required inversion. Blur's previous victory was recast as technical rather than decisive. Oasis's ascent was framed as destiny fulfilled. The rivalry now had a victor in waiting. This inversion intensified psychological pressure on both sides. Oasis became responsible for sustaining a myth of invincibility. Blur became responsible for justifying continued relevance. Neither position allowed for rest. Oasis could not appear uncertain. Blur could not appear static. Both were trapped by the personas that rivalry had hardened into expectation. At this stage, the conflict extended beyond music into behavior. Interviews sharpened. Language coarsened. Insults grew less playful and more absolute. What had once been mediated through irony and bravado now surfaced as raw hostility. This shift mattered. When rivalry moves from symbolic opposition to personal animosity, it accelerates burnout. Identity becomes performance without recovery. The public absorbed this hostility as spectacle. Conflict sustained attention. Outrage clarified allegiance. Each escalation confirmed the importance of the narrative. What might otherwise have been dismissed as excess was now justified as consequence. The rivalry validated itself by producing material that demanded coverage. Yet beneath this expansion, cracks began to appear. Oasis's scale required maintenance. Songs grew longer, denser, more insistent. Confidence edged toward excess. Repetition risked self-parody. The very simplicity that had enabled connection now risked monotony. Momentum, once self-sustaining, began to demand reinforcement. Blur, sensing exhaustion in their established role, began to destabilize their own identity. Rather than compete on the same symbolic terrain, they shifted direction. Their sound fractured. Influence expanded outward. Noise replaced clarity. Directness replaced commentary. This was not retreat. It was displacement. By refusing to occupy the expected position, they disrupted the logic of comparison. This move carried risk. Abandoning a defined persona threatens recognition. But it also creates escape. Blur's transformation functioned as refusal. It declined the terms of rivalry without declaring surrender. In doing so, it exposed the rigidity of the conflict itself. If one side evolves, the rivalry loses symmetry. Without symmetry, opposition weakens. Culturally, this period marked the beginning of Britpop's saturation point. What had once felt insurgent now felt repetitive. The same symbols circulated too frequently. The same references echoed too loudly. The rivalry, once energizing, began to feel compulsory. It no longer clarified difference. It enforced it. Oasis, bound to their role as dominant force, found adaptation more difficult. Expansion had been their answer to pressure. But expansion has limits. Once everything is louder, bigger, and more certain, there is nowhere left to go without collapse. Confidence that cannot modulate becomes brittle. Excess reveals fragility. This phase of the rivalry was defined less by confrontation than by divergence. One band attempted to escape the frame. The other attempted to fill it completely. The tension no longer lived in weekly charts or headlines. It lived in the unsustainable demands placed on identity. The rivalry had reached a point where escalation no longer produced clarity. It produced strain. The conflict was still visible. It still generated attention, but its energy had shifted. What had once felt like momentum now felt like inertia. The next movement would not be driven by provocation, but by consequence. The rivalry had created conditions that neither side could fully control. And conditions, once established, exert their own pressure. The final phase of escalation did not arrive with confrontation. It arrived with fatigue. By the late 1990s, the rivalry had completed its symbolic work and begun to consume its own foundations. What once produced distinction now produced repetition. What once sharpened identity now narrowed it. The conflict no longer expanded meaning. It compressed it. Oasis reached the apex of their expansion and discovered that scale carries its own gravity. The expectations placed upon them were no longer external. They had internalized them. Each release was required to feel definitive, to justify the myth that had grown around them. Songs became heavier, arrangements denser, declarations louder. The music strained under the weight of its own certainty. Confidence, once liberating, began to sound compulsory. This moment revealed a structural vulnerability. When identity is built on inevitability, any deviation reads as failure. Oasis could not retreat into ambiguity without fracturing the image that sustained them. Subtlety would have felt like weakness. Restraint would have felt like concession. The only available direction was further amplification. But amplification without variation leads not to dominance, but to saturation. Blur, having already destabilized their previous position, moved further away from the arena that had defined the rivalry. Their work grew less concerned with representing Britain as a legible object and more concerned with disassembling the mechanisms that had demanded representation in the first place. Noise, fragmentation, and emotional immediacy replaced caricature and commentary. This was not a rejection of identity, but a refusal to be confined by it. The psychological contrast between the two approaches became stark. Oasis attempted to preserve coherence by reinforcing their existing image. Blur accepted incoherence as a form of escape. One doubled down on solidity. The other embraced volatility. These choices were not simply artistic. They were survival strategies shaped by the positions each band occupied within the rivalry. Media response followed predictably. The narrative of dominance began to fracture as excess became visible. Critics who had celebrated certainty now questioned it. Audiences who had found refuge in anthemic assurance began to sense fatigue. The spotlight, once flattering, started to expose. Oasis's expansion revealed limits rather than horizons. The myth strained against reality. At the same time, Blur's refusal to remain legible disrupted the rivalry's logic. Without a stable opponent, opposition loses definition. Rivalry requires symmetry. It requires two forces occupying comparable symbolic positions. As Blur stepped out of that alignment, the conflict lost coherence. It could no longer function as a clean binary. The story that had sustained attention began to unravel. This unraveling coincided with broader cultural shifts. The late 1990s marked a transition away from inward-looking national narratives toward more globalized anxieties. Technology accelerated perception. The future intruded. Music that looked backward or inward began to feel insufficient. Britpop's fixation on Britishness, once energizing, now felt insular. The rivalry that had defined the movement suddenly appeared provincial. In this environment, the conflict between Blur and Oasis began to feel like a relic of a moment already passing. It had shaped the terrain, but it could no longer define it. New voices emerged that did not position themselves within its framework. Their concerns lay elsewhere. The arena emptied not through defeat, but through obsolescence. For Oasis, this shift was destabilizing. Their identity had been built in opposition and assent. Without a clear adversary, and without the cultural conditions that had amplified their certainty, coherence faltered. Internal tensions surfaced. The performance of dominance became harder to sustain. The band's center of gravity fractured under accumulated strain. Blur, having already accepted instability, adapted more fluidly. Their willingness to abandon fixed identity allowed them to persist beyond the rivalry's collapse. But this persistence came at a cost. The clarity and accessibility that had once defined their appeal dissipated. In escaping the frame, they also left behind the mass identification that rivalry had enabled. What remained was aftermath rather than resolution. The rivalry did not conclude with acknowledgement or reconciliation. It dissolved as the conditions that had sustained it changed. The escalation had reached a point where further amplification produced diminishing returns. The conflict had exhausted its symbolic usefulness. This phase is crucial because it reveals the underlying function of rivalry itself. Rivalries do not exist to be won. They exist to structure meaning during periods of uncertainty. Once that function is fulfilled, they collapse. Blur and Oasis had served as vessels for a cultural negotiation about class, authenticity, confidence, and representation. When that negotiation moved on, the vessels were left behind. By the time the dust settled, neither band occupied the position they once had. The rivalry had propelled them to heights that might not have been reachable otherwise. It had also confined them within roles that proved unsustainable. Escalation had given way to consequence. The arena was no longer active, but its imprint remained. The conflict had run its course not because one side prevailed, but because the structure that demanded opposition could no longer hold. What followed would not be about competition, but about interpretation. The rivalry had become history. Its meaning would now be constructed retrospectively, shaped by memory rather than momentum. Once the rivalry detached from the immediate actions of the bands, it began to operate as a cultural mechanism rather than a musical dispute. Blur versus Oasis no longer required new material to sustain itself. It lived on through repetition, memory, and symbolic shorthand. The conflict had become a structure through which Britain explained itself to itself during a moment of transition. At its core, the rivalry functioned as a narrative solution to diffuse social tension. Britain in the 1990s was renegotiating identity after economic rupture and ideological exhaustion. Optimism was returning, but it lacked coherence. The rivalry offered clarity by reducing complexity into opposition. North and South, articulation and force, observation and belief. These binaries were imperfect, but they were legible. They allowed a fragmented culture to imagine itself as divided rather than dispersed. This division was reinforced through media amplification. Coverage did not merely report events. It produced meaning by arranging them within a familiar dramatic arc. Headlines transformed routine industry decisions into symbolic clashes. Language borrowed from combat, sport, and conquest. Charts were framed as verdicts. Success was moralized. Failure was personalized. In doing so, the media created a loop in which attention justified escalation, and escalation justified further attention. The public did not passively consume this narrative. It participated in it. Identification with a band became a way of articulating values that extended beyond music. To align with Blur was to align with irony, distance, and cultural literacy. To align with Oasis was to align with confidence, immediacy, and refusal of refinement. These alignments were not static identities, but situational expressions. They allowed individuals to perform belonging within a contested cultural field. This process intensified tribalism. Fans did not simply enjoy music. They defended positions. Arguments about songs became arguments about legitimacy. Taste acquired moral weight. This moralization mattered because it transformed preference into conviction. Once conviction enters the field, compromise becomes betrayal. The rivalry hardened into something that felt existential rather than aesthetic. Symbolically, the conflict operated through space. Oasis occupied the arena. Their music imagined vast crowds, open skies, and collective voice. It expanded outward. Blur occupied the city. Their music moved through streets, interiors, and social microspaces. It folded inward. These spatial metaphors reinforced the sense that the bands represented incompatible modes of being. One claimed territory through volume, the other through definition. Power functioned differently on each side. Oasis projected power as presence. Their authority came from occupying space so fully that resistance felt futile. Blur projected power as framing. Their authority came from interpretation, from deciding how experience should be seen. These are distinct forms of dominance. One overwhelms, the other organizes. The rivalry allowed these forms to be staged against each other without requiring explicit articulation. The symbolic economy of the conflict was sustained by projection. Each side became a screen for anxieties that exceeded music. Class resentment, cultural insecurity, and fear of inauthenticity all found expression through the rivalry. Accusations of pretension or stupidity were never just about songs. They were about who had the right to speak, who was allowed complexity, and whose voice counted as real. Importantly, the rivalry also disciplined the artists themselves. Once symbolic roles were assigned, deviation carried risk. Blur was expected to remain clever. Oasis was expected to remain confident. Any movement outside these expectations threatened the narrative coherence that sustained attention. In this way, the conflict enforced identity rather than merely reflecting it. It turned difference into obligation. The wider cultural impact extended beyond Britpop. The rivalry established a template for media-driven opposition that would be replicated repeatedly. Future artists were framed against one another before relationships existed. Conflict became a promotional strategy. Difference was exaggerated to manufacture stakes. What had emerged organically between Blur and Oasis was later imitated mechanically, often without substance. This replication drained the original conflict of its uniqueness. In hindsight, its intensity appears inseparable from its historical moment. It worked because the cultural conditions were unstable enough to require symbolic anchoring. As those conditions changed, the template remained, but its power diminished. Manufactured rivalries lacked the psychological depth and social resonance that had animated the original. The most enduring symbolic effect of the rivalry lies in how it reframed British music's relationship to identity. It demonstrated that national culture could be contested internally rather than defined externally. Britishness was no longer a fixed inheritance. It was a position to be argued, claimed, and defended. Music became a site of ideological negotiation rather than mere expression. At the same time, the rivalry revealed the cost of such negotiation when it hardens into spectacle. What begins as exploration can become enclosure. The clarity provided by opposition can eventually suffocate nuance. By the end of the 1990s, Britpop's symbolic machinery had exhausted itself. The rivalry that once energized the movement now signaled its limits. Yet its imprint remains visible. The language used to describe British music still echoes the binaries forged during that period. Authenticity is still measured against artifice. Confidence is still contrasted with intelligence. These distinctions persist not because they are accurate, but because they are familiar. They offer a vocabulary for conflict that remains emotionally efficient. In this sense, Blur versus Oasis did not merely reflect a cultural moment. It helped produce one. It shaped how difference was perceived, how allegiance was formed, and how power was imagined within popular culture. The rivalry became a mythic structure, not because it resolved anything, but because it organized uncertainty into a story that could be told. What followed would not erase this structure. It would recontextualize it. The final movement of the narrative would examine how the rivalry survives after its practical relevance has faded, and why it continues to matter long after the arena has emptied. After the arena emptied, the rivalry did not disappear. It condensed. What had once unfolded in real time through charts, interviews, and release schedules migrated into memory, where it became more stable, more symbolic, and less accountable to fact. Blur versus Oasis survived not as an active conflict, but as a cultural reference point. A shorthand. A story Britain continues to tell about itself when it needs to explain the 90s, or explain confidence, or explain division without naming its deeper causes. In retrospect, the rivalry appears cleaner than it ever was. Memory trims excess. It sharpens silhouettes. Blur becomes intelligence. Oasis becomes belief. The Messier realities recede. The myth gains coherence at the expense of nuance. This is not distortion so much as function. Cultural memory does not preserve events. It preserves meanings that remain useful. The rivalry endured because it offered a durable grammar for understanding difference. For Oasis, the aftermath was marked by fragmentation rather than disappearance. The scale they achieved proved impossible to sustain indefinitely. Internal tensions surfaced once external opposition lost clarity. Without a rival to push against, the energy that had fueled expansion turned inward. Confidence, once collective, fractured into individual assertion. The myth of inevitability could not survive repetition without renewal. What remained was legacy without momentum. Blur's trajectory followed a different arc. Their willingness to abandon fixed identity allowed for continued evolution, but at the cost of mass centrality. They persisted, but they no longer occupied the symbolic center they once held. Their survival was quieter, more distributed, less mythic. In stepping outside the rivalry, they escaped its constraints, but also its gravitational pull. Relevance shifted from dominance to endurance. Neither outcome constitutes victory. Rivalries of this scale do not resolve through triumph. They resolve through dissipation. What they leave behind is not a winner, but a landscape altered by the forces that once moved through it. British music after the 90s carried the imprint of this conflict in its skepticism toward grand narratives and its caution around manufactured certainty. The excesses had been witnessed. The cost had been felt. The rivalry's most lasting effect lies in how it shaped the relationship between music, media, and identity. It demonstrated how quickly artistic difference can be transformed into symbolic warfare, and how eagerly institutions participate in that transformation. It revealed the power of amplification to solidify roles, harden personas, and accelerate burnout. These lessons remain embedded in the industry's reflexes, even when they are not consciously acknowledged. At the same time, the rivalry continues to offer a form of nostalgic clarity. In an era of fragmented attention and diffuse identity, the idea of a single cultural fault line feels almost comforting. Blur versus Oasis represents a moment when conflict appeared legible, when sides could be chosen, when music felt capable of carrying collective meaning without irony. This nostalgia does not reflect reality. It reflects longing for coherence. Importantly, the myth endures because it resists closure. There is no reconciliation narrative that dissolves its tension. Later moments of mutual respect or collaboration do not overwrite the structure that was formed. They exist alongside it, complicating but not erasing the story. The rivalry persists as an unresolved equation, open to reinterpretation rather than conclusion. This persistence speaks to the nature of cultural myths themselves. They do not exist to be settled. They exist to be revisited. Each generation projects new concerns onto the same framework. Class, authenticity, intelligence, populism, confidence. These questions have not disappeared. They have merely changed language. The rivalry remains useful because it offers a way to stage them without resolving them. In this sense, Blur versus Oasis operates less like a historical event and more like a recurring pattern. Two forces emerge from the same conditions. They diverge in style, posture, and strategy. The culture, seeking orientation, arranges them into opposition. Meaning is generated through comparison. Energy accumulates through conflict. Eventually, the structure collapses under its own rigidity. What remains is memory, myth, and residue. The aftermath is therefore not an ending, but a settling. The dust falls. The outlines remain. The arena stands empty, but its architecture is still visible. New conflicts may occupy it, but they do so under the shadow of what came before. Blur and Oasis no longer need to act for the rivalry to persist. It has detached from them. It belongs to culture now. The legacy is not harmony, nor regret, nor triumph. It is clarity without comfort, a demonstration of how power, identity, and visibility intersect under pressure. A reminder that rivalry can illuminate as much as it distorts, and that the stories cultures tell about conflict often reveal more about their needs than about the individuals involved. The rivalry endures because it never promised resolution. It promised recognition, and recognition, once given form, rarely disappears.